At the northern edge of the imperial palace, beyond the paths nobles favored, Eve trained in the windbreak forest where dense Zelkova trees muted sound and light alike. It had become her private proving ground. She inhaled deeply and shifted the flow within her mana core. Silver threads burst outward. They spread in a 10-meter radius, delicate as silk, lethal as blades. The barrier magic passed down from the sage of the spruce forest, arachne of silver death, wove through the air. It was deceptively categorized as barrier magic, yet anything that moved within it could be sliced apart instantly. Michael stood inside the domain. The threads brushed through his body without resistance. Eve startled. She had not sensed him approach. He calmly observed that her control had grown precise enough that entering her domain was no longer truly dangerous. But the truth unsettled her. Because of the imprint between them, he could not resist her power. If she crushed him within her realm, he would have to accept it. He put it simply, too simply. Since it means being in your arms, even if you crush me, I have to accept it. The metaphor struck her harder than the magic ever could. She flushed, annoyed at her own imagination. The memory of the first time she had cast the spell, when it tore through trees in a 50-meter frenzy, reminded her how close she had once come to injuring him. Now he encouraged her to practice against real opponents. Human ones. After training, they crossed the palace gardens and encountered Rosenit and Sylvestian among the yellow roses. The greeting was polite. Too polite. Eve looked at her younger sister and finally understood the truth the sage had revealed. Rosenit had poisoned her in her past life because she had fallen in love with Michael. The jealousy had not been political, it had been personal. Eve suppressed the sting of betrayal. The murder had not yet happened in this life. Revenge now would be meaningless. She simply hoped, silently, that Rosenit would not love Michael again. Rosenit attempted to engage Michael in conversation. He deliberately distanced himself, answering with rigid formalities until the exchange became awkward. When they finally left, he admitted something quietly. He felt an instinctive rejection toward the 8th princess. Both of them realized at the same time it might be the unconscious residue of a past life. Perhaps some part of him remembered who had killed Eve. That possibility tightened something in Eve's chest. When she looked at him, she almost looked as though she might cry. He noticed. She denied it. Back at her chambers, Sedila later reported on the expansion of the pearl business among allied noble houses, luxury ink and sealing wax, pearl pigments for bathhouses, wagon paint as moving advertisement, cosmetics nearing release. Eve gave strategic suggestions, thinking in terms of branding and influence. The empire was her chessboard now. She teased Sedila about renovating her townhouse and remembered vividly the day her loyal maid had wept upon discovering the lavish gift Eve had secretly given her. Sedila, once a fallen noble surviving on wages, had never imagined owning property in the capital. Soon after, Leanne delivered musical tickets to the Pegasus Troupe's performance starring Ramona Lund, the artist Eve secretly sponsored. Michael was less than pleased. The musical was another romanticized tale of a princess and a homunculus knight. Still, he accompanied her, disguised as a gardener while she wore a maid's attire. The musical unsettled Eve. In it, a princess remembered her past life and used her homunculus knight for political power before eventually falling in love. The implication struck too close to home. She lowered her head through most of it. Michael, however, focused not on the princess, but on the villain, who resembled the third princess. He interpreted it as commentary on public opinion. Eve realized she had overreacted. Afterward, they visited the troupe leader to formalize sponsorship paperwork. Eve quietly warned him against allowing Ramona to attend lewd noble gatherings. She offered extra funding for original compositions. Ramona later confronted Eve, demanding to know the identity of her mysterious sponsor. Michael improvised Eve was merely a maid serving Count Arpel's daughter Sedila. Ramona insisted on meeting this Sedila. Ramona dragged Eve forward before she stopped abruptly, shot Michael a glance as she invited Eve's boyfriend along. Michael spoke up, ready to correct Ramona before he stopped, sure the title earned him a place by his princess and chose to stick with the title of boyfriend. His lack of denial startled Eve, but he paid her no mind. And so Eve, cornered by her own generosity, brought her to the townhouse. What followed was chaos. Count Luciard, Marquis Mellos, and Count Ygrin arrived unexpectedly. Sedila warned them cryptically to remain calm no matter what happened. They believed they were being tested. Eve entered disguised as a maid and served tea before them. Anais nearly dropped her composure. Later, Anais revealed the truth. Her sponsor was not merely Count Arpel's household. It was the seventh princess. Shock turned to determination. If she could not wait for an audience with royalty, she would earn one. The violet garden looked gentle enough to be dishonest. Warm wind, high clouds, royal violets blooming in purples that felt almost ceremonial. Eve sat with tea outside for the first time in a while, posture composed, expression calm, mind moving far faster than her teacup. Across from her sat Count Anais, Lucier Dessau, and Alban Redman. Michael stood as escort, present, silent, placed the way he always was when Eve had to wear princesshood like armor in front of witnesses. Alban congratulated Eve on receiving enough public service points to allow her to carry out external projects. This was thanks to Eve's sponsorship of Lamona Lund. And so Eve began checking the ground beneath her plan. She asked about frontier business and the construction pipeline. Alban answered briskly. A family would be selected soon to handle the work. Eve let him finish, then sharpened the conversation deliberately, introducing bribery rumors as bait, and not subtle bait. She dropped the implication in a way that would force a reaction and reveal who had leverage with protocol officials. Alban reacted exactly as she expected, offended on principle, launching into outraged self-image with theatrical indignation. Anais, instead of laughing it off, contributed something useful. She pointed out that Alban's history made bribery accusations difficult to stick. Alban had previously exposed Count Sanchez's corruption connected to manpower inspections. If Redman found corruption, it wasn't as a participant. It was as an executioner. Alban visibly swelled. Eve watched him with a brief, strange kind of relief. He was still odd, still sharp-edged, but in this life his oddness had found an outlet that pointed in the right direction. Then Eve asked what she actually wanted, whether there were finalized plans for the frontier district. Alban produced a rolled plan he'd brought just in case. When he spread it open and began explaining, Eve's interest became real. He had arranged major institutions around the academy, clustered safer housing for poorer residents, and placed homunculus night residences as single houses along the southern outskirts. Most importantly, he planned waterways every 5 blocks, canals that doubled as rainwater treatment. Eve praised it immediately because she could already see how much it would solve without announcing itself: drought management, sanitation stability, and irrigation support if the economy truly pivoted toward agriculture. Build rights in good locations would later be sold at a premium to aristocrats. It was practical, and it was also a silent admission that the frontier district would become a marketplace for influence. Eve's suspicion sharpened into curiosity. She asked who had drawn it. Alban, proudly, his own hand. A skill learned back at Redman Estate, sharpened now into something that could restructure districts and budgets. Eve felt the click in her mind. If she fed him the right mission, he would build the trap himself and feel virtuous doing it. That was when Anais delivered the first warning that mattered. Academy construction would be commissioned separately, and Marquis Chansley was aiming for it. Rumors said Chansley was preparing a bathing business. Eve's tea suddenly tasted thin. Chansley was not just another corrupt noble in Eve's memory. In her past life, that name had soaked itself into catastrophe, dirty money, scandal, rot spreading through respectable society, and disasters that were never accidental. In this life, his distribution routes should not yet be as entrenched, which meant he should not yet be able to move hoarded magic stones smoothly enough to fund swallowing an architecture firm. So, where was the capital coming from? That question lodged in her mind like a hook. Alban checked his pocket watch. He had a meeting. He dashed off, and the three watched Alban's retreating figure. That night, Eve didn't sleep properly. She buried herself in imperial historical records, centuries of archives. She stayed until the library closed around her. By dawn, she had only a blink of rest before Sedila woke her and reminded her it was greeting day. Eve chose a look designed to signal stability rather than rebellion. Calm brown and muted green, hair pinned up, intellectual composure. Something Desmond too would read as reliable. Michael accompanied her. On the route to Sapphire Hall, Eve encountered Euclid. 13 years old, unengraved yet, but already wearing cruelty like inherited jewelry. His honey-blonde smile never reached his eyes. Their destination was the same, so they walked together, and Euclid filled the space with gossip. Eve was disturbing Betty's heart. Eve let it slide until he aimed where it used to hurt. Her mother, her lack of backing, the implication that she had no one who would truly protect her. In her past life, that would have shattered her. In this life, it didn't, not because it wasn't sharp, but because Eve had grown older inside. Regression had given her distance. She could see Euclid now as more than a brat, a child warped by a mother whose loyalty to Bridget had become pathological. And she remembered the trajectory waiting for him. Euclid's future humiliation had been monstrous: arranged marriage for money, begging not to be used, and being crushed anyway. The memory gave Eve an uncomfortable flicker of pity. Then she felt something else. Pressure. Like a blade half-drawn. Euclid turned first. Michael was staring at him with killing intent. Euclid went white. Eve stepped in immediately, snapping Michael back by name and tone. Michael apologized, but the storm didn't fully leave his eyes. Euclid tried to regain arrogance, royal blood demanding obedience, but Eve corrected him cleanly. Michael was her knight, not Euclid's. Then she demanded what she actually wanted: an apology. Euclid resisted until Eve pressed the simplest lever in the world for him: his sword practice. She referenced it with casual precision, the kind that promised exposure, and watched fear wipe his arrogance away. In that empire, swordsmanship was inferior. Worse, it was the only thing Euclid truly had, and the one thing his mother would punish him for if it became visible. Eve softened her voice at exactly the right moment. If he apologized and used only kind words, she would keep it secret. Euclid folded instantly and apologized. The speed of the collapse was almost pitiful. Eve decided quietly that she would feed him sweets later to wash the bitterness of power off her tongue. Sapphire Hall was dark blue splendor, cold in its elegance. Rubio greeted first, loud and warm, platinum hair like a mane. Then Bridget arrived, smirking. She addressed Euclid like a command and used him as a tool to irritate Rubio. Then Desmond too entered. Everyone greeted him in chorus. And unexpectedly, his attention fixed on Eve with warmth. He asked if she was truly okay after the hunting contest. He advised her to care for her mind as well as her body, like a concerned father. The room subtly froze. Desmond II's affection had always belonged elsewhere. Bridget's expression tightened. Stefania tried to pivot the moment back toward Bridget, praising Bridget's quick judgment and commander qualities during the Galamut incident while deliberately erasing Michael's role. Desmond II's response stayed lukewarm until Stefania forced the conversation into policy. Galamut concentrate would eventually exhaust, and the economic disaster that followed would not be gentle. Bridget attempted to stop her. Desmond II disliked policy talk in the greeting room, but Desmond II allowed it. Now the real test began. Stefania laid out inflation risks. Bridget delivered her solution smoothly: increase lesser homunculus labor immediately to raise output, use the time bought to form an intermediate homunculus subjugation squad, and prepare to kill another Lord-class demon dragon. Desmond II approved. Then Bridget turned and aimed her blade at Eve, framing the demand as tradition. The Empire was built on homunculus bodies, now they must give them again. She pushed for Eve's agreement, expecting Eve to either rebel and anger the Emperor, or submit and look weak. She agreed with the goal. She did not agree with the path. She said they needed to secure magic stones reasonable, polite, and then stole the stage in the same breath by offering an in-between solution. Something immediate. Something that didn't require another subjugation campaign right now. Bridget's shock burst out. She accused Eve of lying. Eve cut it off with calm displeasure and moved straight into the weapon she'd built with a sleepless night: evidence. She cited historical and geographic records, names and sources that could not be shrugged away, then reconstructed the logic cleanly. During the Galamut subjugation, there had been a dogfight. In the chaos, Galamut's tail had been severed. A severed piece could crystallize separately, forming a hidden deposit away from the main body. The most probable location was Zelkado's Gorge, near the Galamut mine. Desmond II's excitement ignited instantly. He ordered a Supreme Council meeting on the spot. Ministers were summoned. Eve offered reserve estimates: years of supply at current consumption, longer with efficiency research. She pressed further, warning about hoarders manipulating prices and urging immediate action, so speculators had no time to react. Desmond II ordered distribution routes monitored. Bridget's face turned murderous. Eve simply let the tea sit on her tongue as if nothing in the room could touch her. Greeting time ended early due to urgency. Desmond II commanded Eve to follow him into the Supreme Council. The day became a marathon, meetings from morning into dawn. Eve sat close to the throne, not as decoration but as a voice. She watched nobles watch her. She made them remember her competence the way they remembered bloodlines. And when the final decision landed, it was exactly what she had been carving toward. Eve was appointed in charge of the Zolcado's Gorge expedition. Her dispatch was now official, brilliant, unavoidable, and impossible to deny. Soon after, Eve's emerald carriage rolled toward Baron Parnello's estate, gaudy and out of place in the countryside, its pearl insignia shining like imperial authority wearing modern fashion. Inside, Eve lounged with Peony attending her. Alban, pale with motion sickness, leaned against the wall like a man regretting every life choice that had brought him onto rural roads. Peony teased him for refusing horses. Eve joined in, surprised at herself for doing it. Peony praised Eve's mercy for allowing Alban a carriage seat at all, framing it like royal benevolence. Eve softened the truth. She admitted she had forced Alban into this mission because she needed him, and then told him directly that his presence was proof of her trust. Alban sat up straight. The brightness in his eyes made him look almost young. Outside, Michael reported they'd entered Parnello territory and would arrive late afternoon. Eve asked if anyone needed rest. Michael answered dryly that Count José Sanchez had been complaining, especially after Alban entered the princess's carriage. Eve's mind sharpened at the name. Sanchez had survived allegations without punishment, which meant backing, possibly Chancellery, possibly worse. Bridget would want this expedition disrupted. A new concentrate source would strengthen Eve politically and crash the value of hoarded stones. And Eve had brought Alban, the man who once cracked Sanchez open, onto the same board. For once, she had chosen the right weapon. At Parnello's estate, servants rushed to prepare. A maid carrying a vase noticed a black-haired woman striding down the corridor, leather-clad, sharp-eyed, holding a whip like it belonged in her hand. Cadeline Belcrum, general manager of the Galamut mine. The woman known for squeezing homunculi until they broke. A mining manager position usually rotated every 2 years because exploiting homunculi was treated as routine, not difficult. Yet Cadeline had held power for 5 years straight, proof not of kindness, but of effectiveness. She asked for the Baron. She was told he was in his office. Cadeline Belcrum didn't knock. She shoved open Baron Andres Parnello's office door so hard it rattled the frame. Andres, young, handsome, and buried in documents, jerked in his seat, then pretended composure. "What is it now, Dame Belcrum?" he asked, trying to sound like a lord, not a man cornered. Cadeline didn't soften. "Are you saying the imperial family is coming to see the mine?" Andres hesitated, then chose the safest truth. The official mission was the Zolcado's Gorge, an expedition to search for Galamut's lost tail concentrate. But if the royal party came this far, they would surely want to see the Galamut mine as well. That was the spark. Cadeline's teeth flashed. How much more will they squeeze this time? Andres flinched at her language, because it was accurate. Because he remembered Rubio's recent visit, the first prince's cheerful blindness, as he spoke about longer labor hours like it was a neat adjustment, as if neither the mine's depth nor the homunculi's collapse mattered. Cadeline spat it out with a fury Andres could not afford to voice. The imperial family only cared about the magic stone. They didn't care about the horror of the scene. They didn't care about a collapsing homunculus. Andres, trapped between truth and survival, forced caution into his voice. He insisted the main focus would be the gorge search. He added carefully that this time neither Rubio nor the third princess were coming. And Linlisha, his wife, had spoken differently about the seventh princess. Maybe Eve was different. Cadeline refused to take the bait. A royal was a royal. If Eve had climbed high enough to steal the dispatch from her siblings, Cadeline interpreted it as proof of sharper cruelty, not kindness. And Cadeline said the thing that truly haunted her: whether the search succeeded or failed, the imperial family would still tighten the existing mine's leash. If the new concentrate wasn't found, it would get worse. If it was found, they'd squeeze anyway, just with better excuses. Andres admitted it in a sigh. Labor escalation had always been the short-term answer. Linlisha Parnello welcomed Eve's party with flawless warmth. The rural journey had all but left them dusty and tired. Eve decided to rest and begin the mission the next day. That night, the Parnellos hosted a dinner for the expedition's key members. Eve sat at the head of the table, composed, bright-eyed, every inch a princess. Around her sat Alban Redman, Count José Sanchez of the Protocol Department, and Natasha Emmerich, the High Wizard leading the Ivory Tower search team. Cadeline was also seated, present as the mine's general manager, but sitting stiffly, distrust still coiled in her spine. The food was rich, duck steamed with figs and wine. Linlisha asked softly if it suited Eve. Eve praised the care put into the meal, and the conversation between the two women slid easily into familiar warmth. Linlisha spoke proudly about repaired embankments, reinforced sewage facilities, preparations meant to withstand the next great flood cycle. Eve praised her confidence and reframed it as protection for the Baron's subjects. The table's atmosphere softened. Andres finally managed a bite of duck without feeling like he was swallowing stones. Then Cadeline spoke. She introduced herself formally, general manager of the mine, and, with a controlled bitterness she could barely hold down, suggested something that sounded practical and harmless. The open-air mine was depleted and hard to recover from, so squeezing it wouldn't yield much. Eve should focus on the real prize, the gorge search. Finding a new concentrate was what would truly save livelihoods. On the surface, it was reasonable. Underneath, it was a plea, don't come to the mine. Eve's amber eyes narrowed slightly, her smile sharpening at the edges. Andre stiffened in alarm. Linlisha's polite smile stayed in place, but the angle of her knife in her hand shifted subtle, warning Cadeline to stop. Before Cadeline could dig herself deeper, Count Hosen Sanchez exploded. That's not going to happen, he barked, loudly enough to snap every gaze toward him. He insisted the mine had to come first, short-term measures, productivity, output. In his agitation he nearly said squeeze the homunculi out loud before clumsily correcting himself. Cadeline snapped back. Hosen snapped back again. Mines first. Gorge first. The argument escalated into an ugly tug-of-war with order as its excuse. Linlisha scolded them for their lack of decorum. Natasha, who had been quiet, finally cut through the performance with one blunt sentence. Eve could handle both in parallel. The air shifted. Both Cadeline and Hosen faltered because they'd just revealed they were fighting for influence, not logic. Eve set the plan smoothly. Gorge first to lay groundwork, then a mine inspection. Cadeline's expression soured into quiet despair. With too many ears around, Eve couldn't offer reassurance. Instead, she made herself colder. She adopted the voice of a proper imperial. She supported the Empire's need for short-term productivity. She had been entrusted with increasing output. Desmond too himself had permitted it. She would inspect the homunculus management system for gaps and waste. Cadeline's stomach dropped. Albin, delighted by the tone, chimed in immediately. Squeezing tight is my specialty. Eve praised him and told him to squeeze very tightly. From Cadeline's seat, it sounded like a death sentence disguised as policy. The next day, Eve went to Zelkado's gorge. The gorge was a split in the world, deep black crevices like an abyss. Wizards descended nearly a kilometer down, installing mana search golems, white cubes that spread through the air, designed to detect even faint disruptions caused by a buried magic stone deposit. Eve stayed above, speaking with Natasha while staring down into the vast emptiness. Natasha explained the process. The golems were sensitive but slow, so they would reposition every hour. Their detection range was small, about 50 meters, so even relentless effort would only cover about a kilometer a day. The gorge stretched roughly 40 kilometers. A month, Natasha implied, would not be surprising. She added another problem. Beasts lived below. Subjugation would slow progress further. Eve listened without panic and instructed Natasha not to overdo it, especially on days involving combat. She promised to return daily for reports. Hosen Sanchez offered to remain behind to watch the scene, far too eager. Eve dismissed the oddness with a light acceptance. Then she turned away from the gorge and toward her carriage. Michael offered to escort her back to the Baron's estate. Eve refused. Call Dame Belcram, she said instead. I'm going to the mine. A small, mischievous smile touched her mouth because she was already imagining Cadeline's reaction to the performance she and Albin had staged the night before. Lapis Village sat beside the Galamut open-air mine. Its name sounded pretty. Its reality was barren. The land was still scarred from Galamut's last battle, polluted by breath and magic. The village had almost nothing: narrow roads, cramped huts, one central well that too many depended on. Cadeline guided Albin through the village while he took notes like an auditor. He described the houses as if they were an old architectural style. Cadeline corrected him bluntly. It wasn't a style. It was poverty. They reached the well. Albin immediately grasped the scale of the problem: too many lives attached to a single water source. Homunculi returned in a long, silent procession. Albin noticed something that made him pause. Their hair was white. He understood why. Labor homunculi could not remove their mana restraints in a mine, and years of suppression stripped pigment away. Cadeline forced him to stop commenting like it was curious trivia and look at their faces instead. Their eyes were dull. Their bodies moved like they were saving the last of their strength. Dinner was rye porridge ladled from a cauldron. Cadeline distributed it, and the homunculi thanked her quietly as they received their bowls. Albin inspected the food, noting rye, oats, beans. Cadeline explained the grain came unthreshed from the imperial supply, and there was no mill or oven. Porridge was the only option. Beans, she added, were sent monthly by Linlisha to improve nutrition. Albin noticed porridge being carried to a separate building. Patients who weren't working. Catherine said they still had to eat to recover. He wrote it down anyway. Cadeline, watching him, wanted to strike him, especially when his eyes flicked to the whip at her waist. She explained sharply it was symbolic. She didn't need to whip anyone. The indoctrination did the work. Then Albin said something that surprised her. He acknowledged he'd heard deaths had decreased under her management, and that this was likely why she'd held her post 5 years despite the declining mining output. Cadeline didn't know what to do with recognition from someone she'd labeled a monster. Before she could respond, a subordinate rushed to report the 7th princess was approaching the mine. Cadeline left the village entrance quickly, almost fiercely. The Galamut open-air mine was a gaping wound in the earth, a circular pit nearly a kilometer wide, plunging roughly 500 meters down, narrowing into an inverted cone like a mouth swallowing the world. Eve stared into it and murmured, "It feels like the end of the world." Michael, beside her, noting the intimacy in her words, stated, "That's quite romantic since I get to witness it with you, princess," and Eve had to cough and turn away to hide how his words scrambled her composure. She grounded herself by speaking about facts instead, how Galamut's thought body had been huge, but the real demon dragon scale was beyond imagination, and how the Empire had relied on that enormous reserve for a century, only to burn through stability in a handful of months. Cadeline arrived and greeted Eve. Eve greeted her back and asked how she felt seeing the mine. Cadeline, caught off guard by Eve's directness, let a bitter truth slip. The Empire had priced magic stones too low because it treated labor as if it cost nothing. That illusion made people believe magic stones were free. Eve's eyes widened because she recognized the argument. It was the same truth she'd once spoken elsewhere. Someone's sacrifice was replacing the real cost. Cadeline realized she'd spoken too honestly and turned her head, bracing for punishment. Instead, Eve waited until she was sure they were alone enough, just Eve, Michael, and Cadeline, then said quietly, "You can trust me. You and I are on the same side." Cadeline froze. No royal had ever said that. In the village, homunculi returning bulls saw Eve and went rigid. At Cadeline's announcement, they dropped to their knees, heads to the ground, bowls still in their hands. Eve recognized the posture immediately. It looked too much like Michael kneeling before Desmond II. She thought, with sudden cold clarity, the etiquette of slavery. Her voice stayed gentle but firm when she told them to get up and continue what they were doing. Then she looked around and felt her stomach tighten. The village was worse than she had imagined. The food, the homes, the thin bodies, the hollow eyes. Despair sat in the air like dust, clogging the lungs. Michael asked softly if she was all right. The worry in his voice steadied her. Eve forced her expression smooth. There were too many eyes here. Too many possible informants. If she wanted to act, she had to wear the imperial mask first. That was when Albin arrived. He ran up with a report like a trophy. "Your Majesty, I've found a way to increase efficiency." Eve took the report and saw the subtitle written plainly, "How to Effectively Exploit a Homunculus." Cadeline's heart dropped so hard it felt like it hit the ground. Albin began speaking loudly, whistleblowers with armbands, unequal food distribution, competition as motivation, bread as reward, rations used as currency to buy labor, sick workers trading their share so others could fill their shifts. Eve nodded along with chilling calm, asking questions that made her sound like she was considering it seriously. When Albin dismissed long-term concerns, Eve smiled as if enlightened, thanked him, and worst of all, applauded. Her applause rang out, loud enough that homunculi nearby heard every word. Cadeline watched their faces change, empty bowls suddenly looking like last meals. The air thickened with panic and resignation. Eve continued, still acting. She began issuing orders straight from Albin's report: build a mill and fire pit, renovate houses, plant flowers for appearances, and select homunculi for training the next day. She ordered a temporary shelter built so she could stay and supervise. To Cadeline, it was tyranny rolling forward like a siege engine. That night, she couldn't sleep. The next afternoon, Cadeline rushed back to the village, prepared to witness the training that would finish breaking the homunculi's spirits. Instead, she found construction already underway. Luciard's builders had arrived overnight. Cadeline's suspicion deepened. This speed, was it planned? She hurried to the training site and hid behind a broken wall. Then Alban spoke, and Cadeline's mind went blank. The training was not exploitation. It was education. He announced 3 subjects: farming methods, charcoal making for winter, and threshing and baking. Practical skills tied directly to survival and independence once the mill and fire pit were complete. And then Cadeline watched it happen. Alban and Peony taught with unexpected patience. Homunculi, awkward at first, began learning quickly, their trained minds absorbing information fast once it was finally offered. Eve and Michael weren't supervising like lords. Eve cleared land with gardening magic, sowed seeds, planted seedlings. Michael carried soil, fertilizer, and water like a laborer. Cadeline stood there, stunned, watching the tyranny crack open and reveal something completely different underneath. She overheard Eve and Alban talking about water, aqueduct bridges, agricultural supply, drinking water, real infrastructure. Eve even noted she'd need Desmond 2's license for such a massive project. That was the moment Cadeline finally understood what Eve had meant the day before. Same side. Her throat tightened with shame. Then Eve called her out. Eve already knew she was hiding. Michael had noticed. Cadeline stepped forward, bowed, and apologized. Eve didn't scold her. She handed Cadeline a small note, the required mining quota for next weekend, significantly lower than before. Cadeline was bewildered. Eve explained, previously, it had been easier to mine a little more than to catch the thieves bleeding the distribution route. But Desmond 2 had ordered strict monitoring now. The parasites, stockpilers, and smugglers couldn't touch the stones anymore. So the mine didn't need to bleed itself dry to compensate. Eve added that she would personally oversee transport back to the Yellow Capital and told Cadeline to ensure there was no loss. She framed the reduced quota as good news for Catherine, whose job was measured by daily volume and targets. Cadeline couldn't speak. Tears threatened. Eve's expression softened, and she did the one thing Cadeline had never expected from a royal. Eve stepped forward and patted her shoulder comfortingly. "I'm sorry," Eve said, voice low, "for letting you rot in confusion for days. And thank you for everything you've done." Warmth cracked Cadeline's remaining restraint. She burst into tears, and Eve patted her awkwardly, holding her steady through the small storm she'd unleashed. The commotion was brief, but for Cadeline, it changed the shape of the world. Eve had a barracks built in lapis, and she placed it where it would be seen first. It was splendid, too splendid. It swallowed the village entrance like a banner of conquest, and the homunculus visibly withered beneath it. Eve did not return to Parnello Castle. She stayed in that barracks, day after day, inspecting construction, assisting with alchemy, conducting education, and drafting reports to Desmond 2. Busy as she was, she did not loosen her grip on the expedition's true purpose. Once a day, she rode an hour by carriage to Zalcato's Gorge to check the Manisearch golems herself and receive Natasha Emmerich's reports. Natasha's composure held, but the air around her gave her away. Count José Sanchez had been needling, scolding, obstructing daily. Eve saw it, filed it away, and chose not to touch José yet. Hold on a little longer. On the 4th day, Lapis changed shape. Magic and alchemy moved faster than human patience. A mill and a communal furnace were completed first. The mill, built for threshing and grinding, was designed to run on water power, not magic stones, because magic stones were forbidden in the mining village that existed to mine them. The irony tasted bitter in Eve's mouth, but she swallowed it and praised Alban anyway. The furnaces, 50 of them, were placed at a safe distance and meant to burn firewood, not mana. Alban, quick as ever, added a future promise: buried water pipes, an eventual open-air bath, sanitation. Eve's eyes dimmed at the word bath. For days without one, while drinking water itself was restricted. She recited balance theory to herself and endured. After that came housing. Huts were being dismantled. Plans rose in their place: gray walls, blue roofs, chimneys, winter stoves. Eve demanded flower beds at every house. Alban understood the joke immediately. Their shared smile, to the homunculus watching, looked like a predator's. The next morning, Eve gathered the 20 homunculus she'd selected and made them bake. Alban announced it loudly, performing cruelty as policy. The seventh princess wanted rye bread and corn soup, and they would repeat the process until the taste satisfied her. The smell of bread warmed the air for the first time in living memory. Eve played the part, cross-legged, cool, tasting, with imperial indifference, growing less sincere as hours dragged on. Albin praised even her laziness like genius. Then he overreached, asking to be her most trusted aide. Michael's expression hardened, but Albin only smiled wider, explaining that Hadelamide valued the head over the body. He noted in consolation, Michael used his body to serve Eve and he should leave the thinking to Albin. The insult to Michael came wrapped in comfort. His words flustered Eve. Peony cut in with clean precision. Sedila was first, Albin second. Michael, by elimination, was third. Michael was baffled by his position, so used to being first, and when Eve glanced back, Michael earnestly stated, "I'll work even harder." He wore it like a wound. By late afternoon, baskets of rye bread were stacked high. The bell rang. The homunculi returned from the mine, empty-eyed, dragging themselves, until the smell reached them. Their pace changed. Hunger reorganized the line faster than orders ever had. Albin shouted again, publicly cruel, calling it livestock feed and telling them to be grateful anyway. Eve leaned in and quietly told him to ease the language. Albin refused. Dominance, he insisted, was the Empire's real majesty. Eve felt the shape of the imperial family's eventual ruin in that sentence and had to keep her face still. Michael noticed her mood the way he always did before she could fold it away. He told her, softly, that the homunculus were not stupid, that someone would recognize what she was truly doing. Eve answered that recognition was not the point. Michael's respect landed heavier than praise. He called her courage integrity, regardless of bloodline. "I want my princess to walk a path of honor and praise." Eve, unguarded for a heartbeat, offered him a small private reward. For today, he could be number one. Then she admitted what she could not afford to say loudly, that his understanding mattered more than anyone else's. Eve decided the policy aloud, one meal a day like this, consistently. She spoke of recipes, beans, meat, quietly considering routes and money. Michael warned her about visible flows of spending. Eve dismissed it, half joking about having Albin. Michael's gaze tightened at Albin's name. When Eve equated her trust in Albin with her trust in Michael, Michael's eyes widened, then narrowed again, unsettled by a discomfort he couldn't place. Then Eve remembered the core of it. Michael's kingly power. The sage's warning. Bonding accelerates awakening. Eve interpreted it as intimacy made practical. She instructed Michael to serve food directly, friendly conversation, closeness, a gentle bridge between him and his people. Michael obeyed, but the line at his basket stayed thin. The homunculus approached him with visible discomfort, as if his presence pressed on something they couldn't explain. Michael fell silent and served anyway. A young boy approached him first, hair bleached white, and asked whether the sick in the shelter could also receive bread and soup. Michael went to Eve for permission. Eve rose immediately. She had planned to visit the shelter because hot neck disease, as Lapis called it, had been killing homunculus for decades, and no one in the Empire had bothered to name it properly. Inside the shelter, the truth was worse than ink on paper, bodies stiff as wood, fever raging, muscles locked. Bread would be useless here. Soup, perhaps. Cadeline arrived with the pot and spoke bitterly. These were the closest to death. Eve touched a patient's forehead anyway. Not as a healer with soft hands, but as a wizard trained to read mana cores and circuits like mechanisms. She poured mana lightly into the system, felt the blockage, the weight, the stagnation. "This is a disease I know," she said. She named it timber fever. Stagnant mana accumulating beyond what the core could hold, choking the circuits. Cadeline didn't understand how homunculi, with cores since birth, could suffer this. Michael answered at once, the restraints. The Empire's permanent circuit locks created the perfect conditions for stagnation. A magic disease treated as acceptable waste. Eve did not defend the Empire. She stood with them. The simplest cure, releasing restraints, was impossible politically. Treason. Property. Cadeline said it plainly. Eve agreed and moved on. So the treatment became violence with purpose, mana drain. Drain the excess until the body could breathe again. Michael knew the spell, instinctively, unnervingly. Eve gave him the theory, the limits, the risks. Michael refused the unspoken option of letting Eve do it. His decision was quiet, but absolute. He began. He placed his hand over the worst patient's core and drained. The unconscious body groaned in pain. Minutes passed. Fever eased. Stiffness loosened. The patient's eyes opened. It worked. Cadeline's shock cracked into frantic motion. She ran to spread the news. Michael treated another. Then another. Between patients, he went to the sky to empty his own mana, striking clouds apart with night ray, explosions rolling like thunder over the village. The homunculus stared up in fear and awe. At night, he changed methods, fireballs, quieter in intent, spectacular in result. He miscalculated and nearly dropped from the sky as mana depleted, landing by instinct in front of Eve's barracks. Eve had come out to watch the fireworks. She saw Michael's hair had turned pale pink, depletion mimicking the restraint state. Eve called it pretty. Michael endured the compliment like a man tolerating a weakness. They spoke in low voices. He would finish treatment by morning. She would prepare potion alchemy for after he left, for relapses and future cases. Eve asked, carefully, whether he felt any unusual signs, awakening, change. Michael said no. Eve hid her disappointment behind a small smile. Michael returned to the shelter and treated through the dark hours. The healed homunculus thanked him, calling him by name with honor, and, strangely, did not recoil. The bond Eve wanted was beginning to form in spite of fear. Near dawn, Michael's vision burned white. For an instant he was back in the training camp prison, bars, damp darkness, restraints broken, hair black as night, hundreds of homunculus watching. Then they all knelt to him like a master. The illusion snapped. Reality returned with heat in his chest, his mana core expanding, growing in a way mana drain alone could not explain. He understood, suddenly, with a bitter edge of humor. This was the method. Consensual exchange with his people. The king's power awakening through bond. And with that understanding came an inconvenient question, sharp as a blade's tip. If draining weaker homunculi did this, what would draining a stronger one do? Michael kept his hand steady on the next patient's chest. The first face that rose in Michael's thoughts was silver-haired. It was only after dawn that Michael finished treating the last of the fever-neck patients. Mana drain was not gentle magic. He had forced it again and again through bodies already stiff with stagnation, then burned his own reserves down to the bone with repeated, near-annihilating attacks just to keep himself usable. When the final patient's fever broke, Michael's strength did too. He slid down the wall with Night Ray in his arms, eyelids falling like shutters. And he dreamed. In the dream, the imperial palace glittered with the kind of order that felt unreal after Lapis's dust. Michael's eyes followed a lime-blonde Princess Eve, older by a few years, more composed, a shade farther away. The dream was too vivid to be dismissed as simple sleep. Sensation and emotion moved with the weight of memory. He understood instinctively what it was. A past life. He watched Eve's days unfold, tea in a salon, quiet reading in the library, idle pauses in banquet halls, small scenes made sacred by how relentlessly he kept his attention on her. At first, there was pride in it. Even then, he had guarded her. Even then, he had treated her ordinary moments like treasure. But the longer it went on, the more a thin, sharp wrongness pressed into his chest. Eve was close enough to touch, and yet she felt distant, separated by a wall that shouldn't exist between a princess and her closest knight. When the dream shifted into moments of contact, moonlit conversations, a ballroom dance, a walk through flowers, the past Michael's emotion was not ease. It was yearning. A child's desperate wanting for something always just out of reach. Then the scene snapped to a garden of falling blossoms. Eve offered him oolong tea, spoke politely, formally, too stiff, too unlike her. And then she dismissed him. She sent him to the 8th princess. The cold that ran through Michael at those words was immediate and total. His body moved in the dream without his consent, turning away from Eve. At the garden entrance, Rosenet smiled as if she'd been waiting. "Why are you so late, my knight?" The title landed like a verdict. Eve woke to clean sunlight and found Peony still asleep on the cot. She washed quietly, changed, and registered the empty space behind the partition with a single sharp thought. Michael hasn't come back. The village was already in its work rhythm, homunculus heading to the mines, footsteps dull and automatic. Eve crossed the quiet paths and reached the shelter, where Cadeline had erected a new temporary treatment barracks. Amber fluttered out to greet her, cheerful as if the world hadn't spent the night chewing on death. Eve called for Michael. No answer. Inside, Michael lay with Night Ray held close, so still he looked like a statue that had merely chosen to rest. Eve approached, closer than she allowed herself to be with anyone, and only then noticed what sleep usually concealed, the severe line of his brow beneath black bangs, the defenselessness that made even stillness feel dangerous to look at for too long. She caught herself, just as his breathing broke. Michael's chest heaved, whole body shaking with a sudden, harsh hyperventilation. Eve's mind leapt to the worst possibility, a mana collision. Rare, but not impossible after the night he'd had. She called his name and reached. Michael's eyes opened. Eve checked his mana without asking permission, fingers closing around his hand as she searched his circuits for fracture. No collision. No rupture. Relief hit her so hard it made her dizzy. She tried to let go. Michael didn't. He held her hand as if the contact had become necessary, not accidental. Confusion tightened his features, then he asked, voice low, uncharacteristically raw, for her to stay like that a moment longer. Eve told him it was exhaustion and ordered him back to her barracks to sleep. Michael shook his head. He said he'd had a nightmare, one where he became a direct knight to someone other than Eve. Rose in it. Eve laughed once, bitter and honest. She admitted it would be a nightmare for her too. Michael's face softened, then sharpened again, as if he were trying to seal every crack in fate with words. He described the dream, Eve sending him away, Rose in it waiting, the title that shouldn't exist. And then, quietly, dangerously, he asked Eve why she'd left him. Eve understood in that instant that this wasn't about logic. It was about the thin line where memory, fear, and awakening tangled together. She pulled stabilizing magic through their joined hands, forcing composure into the room first, into herself, then into him. It's a dream, she said evenly. Forget it. I can't leave you. Michael's resentment faded, but it didn't dissolve. It condensed into possession. It's not enough not to throw me away, he said. I don't want to be taken by another royal. Eve answered like a ruler closing a negotiation, quick and absolute. I am the one who can give orders to you. You are my knight. Then, more bluntly, to end the wavering. You belong to me, Michael. The effect was immediate. Michael went still. He brought the back of her hand to his forehead, not the formal kiss of fealty, but something closer, urgent in a way that didn't ask permission. Yes, he said, voice thick with too much feeling. I am yours. And somewhere behind his eyes, something stubborn grew larger than reason. By the 6th day of the expedition, Count José Sanchez was rotting in his own frustration. He had been stationed at Salcado's Gorge daily under the guise of oversight, but his real purpose was Bridget's, sabotage the search golems, buy time for stockpiled magic stones to move, and make Eve look incompetent enough to lose Desmond II's trust. His plan depended on quiet, on patience, on corruption doing what it always did. Then news reached him that Eve had fixed the timber fever disease and boosted Lapis productivity. José hadn't even known the disease existed. Bridget's letter arrived soon after, thinly veiled contempt, a demand to do better. José's fear sharpened into urgency. If Eve kept accumulating results, his timeline collapsed. So he shifted targets. The village. He arranged a meeting with Albin, intending to pry open loopholes. Albin treated him with deliberate disrespect, then carelessly, as if he couldn't imagine anyone understanding, allowed José to see the report. The subtitle hooked José's attention like a blade. How to effectively exploit the homunculus. José read, page after page, and what began as gloating turned into a colder, more sincere terror. If Eve truly operated like this, results would come fast. Too fast. He needed a village-level disaster that would force Eve's attention away from the gorge. Albin, still playing his part, mentioned casually that Lapis had only one well. José's mind filled in the rest. 2 nights later, under a quiet moon, José moved. He approached the well under invisibility magic and poured a black liquid into Lapis's only drinking water source, thought poison, forbidden even among the worst. A contamination that would linger for decades, bleeding into land already weak from Galamut's war. He might have succeeded if Eve hadn't already built her village on watchers. Michael and Albin were waiting in the dark. Michael struck first, flame bursting at José's feet, nullification stripping the invisibility away. He lifted the man by the back of his neck, as if he weighed nothing. Count Sanchez, Michael said flatly. Albin raised his voice until the village woke, until homunculus spilled into the street, drawn by fear and the word well. José tried the only shield aristocrats ever trusted, status and bluster. He demanded release, called a homunculus insolent. Then a new voice cut through the night. Eve arrived in a chemise and shawl, amber eyes colder than the moonlight behind her. The homunculus parted instinctively, making a road for the only authority they had ever been trained to recognize. Hosen tried to speak over her. Eve didn't even address the attempt. "I am the only one who can give Sir Agneto orders here," she said, and the sentence alone shrank him. Cadeline followed, paling at the sight of the well's blackening energy. Michael named the crime aloud, thought poison, and the air thickened with dread. Hosen tried to exploit a technicality. If he was invisible, how could anyone have seen? Michael didn't argue what he'd seen. He dismantled Hosen with a single, surgical question. How did Hosen know it was invisibility magic when Albin had only said magic? Hosen panicked into confessing the shape of his own method. Eve, almost smiling, moved to seal it properly. She announced she'd trace the remaining magical residue, then watched Hosen flinch away from her hand like a guilty man fearing touch. Natasha arrived at the well at the worst possible moment for Hosen. Her report was clipped lethal. 2 ivory tower wizards had been bribed by Count Sanchez. One had supplied the invisibility scroll. Both were already locked in Parnello's dungeons. And then Eve lifted her hand again. Amber, perched obediently, made the final piece unavoidable. Her guardian golem had surveillance functions. It had recorded evidence, not witnesses. A clean blade, not a blunt club. Hosen collapsed into the mud, begging. Eve did not waver. She used immersion magic to contain him. There was no prison in Lapis, and delegated interrogation and disposal to Albin with the ease of someone assigning paperwork. Albin accepted with shining eyes. Eve then turned immediately to command, because the village could not afford to watch her savor victory. The well would be filled with clean soil, purification magic poured, yet it would remain unusable. Drinking water became an emergency. Eve spoke the real problem plainly. Groundwater might be compromised, and dependence on a single source had always been Lapis's vulnerability. So she announced the solution she'd been circling for days. A new water source. An aqueduct from the lake to the village, permission to be wrung from Desmond II using Count Sanchez's crime as leverage. She assigned roles without hesitation, Albin to draft and carry the letter personally, Peony to alert Luciard's builders, Cadeline to procure drinking water from farther sources and prepare magic balloons for transport, because the lake route was blocked by a beast. Then, with the village moving again under her orders, Eve looked down at Hosen in the mud, moonlight behind her, calm in her eyes that should have held strain. And with a small, almost curious smile, she spoke as if continuing a private thread only she and the guilty man could understand. Eve said softly, "You shouldn't have gotten on Albin's bad side." Hosen's denial collapsed the moment the sky betrayed him. 3 profane magic bullets rose from the direction of Zelkado's gorge, white flares tearing open the night. The signal had existed since the expedition first departed the capital, Discovery. For a breath, the world went silent. Then the village moved. Wizards, attendants, homunculus who had only just begun to disperse after the well incident gathered again, excitement overriding fear. They found something. A new magic concentrate. Congratulations rose in waves toward Eve. She received it with a soft, controlled smile. "I will report it to His Majesty." There was no triumph in her tone, only calculation. Hosen, staring up from the pit where he was bound, understood too late. The water crisis, the sabotage, the delay, none of it had disrupted the real tempo of events. She had been moving ahead of him all along. By noon the next day, Eve moved between Lapis Village and Zelkado's Gorge without pause. Drinking water logistics, purification, new mining reports, her time fractured into precise segments. Sleep became brief moments stolen inside a carriage, her head sometimes leaning against Michael's shoulder, sometimes resting on his knees. She did not notice. Michael did. At the canyon site, the mood was electric. Magic lanterns burned against the stone walls. Wizards clung to vertical surfaces with flight spells, carefully widening what had begun as a meteor-like crater. The mine was deep, and as they approached the vein, magic use became restrained. Reckless casting near a concentrate could cause catastrophe. Natasha greeted Eve with visible exhilaration. In her hands was a large fragment of ore, studded with gemstone crystal. The purity was exceptional, at least Class A. And then came the second revelation. The stones were not merely high-grade. They drained ambient mana. Rechargeable. Only a handful of such crystals had ever existed, most traced back to the first demon dragon of Lok. Ordinary magic stones were cartridge type. Once spent, they were replaced. These, however, contained structures functioning like mana cores. They could replenish. The implications rippled outward. 10 years of reserves became decades. Perhaps a century. Michael studied the raw crystal and observed quietly that it resembled the magic stone Eve had once given him. Eve agreed. But even as Natasha rejoiced, Eve's thoughts darkened. Rechargeable stones would not simply flood the market. The imperial family controlled supply. Magic stones were the empire's blood. Distribution would be measured, calculated, channeled toward aristocratic infrastructure and imperial facilities. And in time, when scarcity needed renewal, the demon dragons would have to fall again. The memory of Ambrox's subjugation surfaced in her mind. Hundreds of homunculus dead. Michael among the strongest present, his power already matured. Victory purchased in lives. She would have to send him again. Michael, unaware of the direction of her thoughts, spoke lightly about rising in rank through battlefield merit. He smiled as he stated, "I'll be you honor, princess." Eve did not smile. He corrected himself quickly, sensing the shift. She told him only that his existence itself strengthened her, that he need only remain by her side. It was not the whole truth. It was the only version she could afford. At her words, Michael's heart beat faster as a result, feeling good even after her light reprimand. Back in Lapis, the poisoned well had been filled and flattened. Purification magic flowed over contaminated soil. Raman of the Green Potion Workshop arrived via emergency portal, summoned under royal seal. He produced purification agents and a man-infarction remedy as expected. Recovery would take 20 years, even under careful management. The land was weakened from previous war contamination. Resilience had limits. Eve absorbed the timeline without visible frustration. Water became the immediate crisis. As she pondered possible solutions, Pony handed Eve a tonic for fatigue and recovery, worried for Eve's health. Eve drank it and was astounded by its immediate effects. Pony smiled slyly as she noted the tonic's effects to improving men's stamina too. She dashed out of the tent, promising to have the palace well stocked upon their return, leaving behind an awkward Eve and stoic Michael. She assured Michael she'd drink them all, but Michael teased that he should have some too, since someone might inquire about its effectiveness, as it was well-known rumor that Eve's stamina far exceeded his own. Eve groaned, embarrassed, and Michael laughed mischievously. Cadeline requested an audience and entered immediately reported that drinking water supply being transported via magic-powered aircraft from the Rasatora River took too much time, and therefore, she'd halted operations hoping for a better, faster solution. She suggested procuring water through magic, but Eve explained that magic-based atmospheric extraction would destabilize the region's moisture balance. Crops would fail. So she chose something else. Milk instead of water. Baroness Pinello arrived with a herd of goats, acquired at Eve's expense, under the authority of her title. Goat milk would sustain the village until the aqueduct could be built. Cheese, butter, wool, long-term resilience. Cadeline understood the cost. Eve had sacrificed prestige for practicality. Eve dismissed the sentiment. "I am only creating the foundation," she said. "Use it well." Then she waited. Alban returned from the capital with the imperial seal, authorization to construct an aqueduct from Lake Mellet. Desmond, too, had been pleased. A banquet would commemorate the discovery. Rewards promised. Even Count Sanchez's crime had drawn imperial fury, not merely for treason against property, but for endangering the princess herself. Hassan's fate was sealed. With permits secured, only one task remained before water security could be completed. Subjugate the beast of Lake Mellet. Eve would accompany Michael. Outside the palace, direct knights did not leave their royals. The journey to the lake was made on horseback. No carriage path existed through the uneven terrain. Vegetation thickened as they approached water. Then the lake revealed itself, mint-colored surface, petals floating like perfumed oil in a goddess's bath. Too peaceful. Michael tested the surface with a stone. The response was immediate. 9 immense gray-olive serpentine bodies rose, eyeless and grotesque, mouths cavernous and blind. Water worms rather than snakes. Coordinated, not mindless. They attacked in sequence, attempting to crush and swallow. Michael studied before striking. Night ray flashed. The first head fell, but did not die. He adjusted. Cutting in measured intervals, he located the vulnerable point. After several precise strikes, one body collapsed into the water. 2 more followed. The rest retreated. Michael froze the surface, advanced along ice, and finished them, shattering both ice and flesh in a single explosive release. Steam swallowed the debris. But the count was wrong. More rose from the lake. 12 this time. Not individuals. Tentacles. The true body had yet to surface. Michael advanced to the lake's center and tore the water apart with a crescent slash powerful enough to send tidal waves toward the shore. Eve raised a barrier calmly. The lake convulsed. Then the monster emerged. A colossal aquatic nepenthes, house-sized bloom, petals spread wide, shark-like maw at its core. Tentacle roots writhed in masses beneath. If the beast would not rise willingly, he would force it. Mana surged. The lake began to boil. Steam climbed in columns. The nepenthes, unwilling to be cooked alive, erupted upward, anchoring itself to shore with tentacle roots to escape the scalding depths. Its full form towered above the lake. Eve recoiled not from fear, but from disgust. Michael interpreted it differently. "You have stained the princess's eyes," he said coldly. Tentacles lashed across the land. Eve finally moved. Arachne unfolded. Silver threads, invisible and razor-fine, sliced every root that entered her domain into fragments. Purple fluid splattered harmlessly. The barrier did not falter. Michael paused only a fraction of a second, noting the elegance of her defense. Fraudulent, he thought with quiet admiration. Even to him. Freed from concern for her safety, he advanced. He ran along the severed roots as if they were a bridge. The water still steamed beneath. Tentacles whipped. He cut through them. He climbed toward the core. The battle had shifted. And this time, the body would not retreat. Nepenthes weakened fast the moment it fled the lakebed and exposed its body to Michael's heat. Steam rolled off the water like a lid lifting from a cauldron, and the giant bloom trembled, petals slackening as its strength bled away. Michael reached it in a few breaths. Night Ray rose toward the throat, where the core should be buried like a heart behind muscle. He drove the blade in. 2 massive petals tore open in reflex, shuddering from the shock. But it didn't die. The body is too large. The core is buried deep. Michael studied for the next strike and felt the air change. Nepenthes answered desperation with calculation. A roar erupted deep enough to rattle the stones. Then the grotesque mass dropped back into the lake. For a heartbeat, it looked like suicide, throwing itself into boiling water. Then the lake edge began to collapse. Not retreat. A trap. The shore crumbled like it had been eaten from underneath. Cold air rose from deep earth as if the beast were forcing a temperature shift, trying to break Michael's control by stirring the lake's buried chill. Michael's instincts snapped tight. And then Eve screamed. Not disgust, pain, shock, the kind that made a knight's blood stop. Michael turned and saw the flaw in Arachne's perfection, the ground beneath her. The bank under Eve's boots sloughed away into a steep slope that led straight into the lake. Hot water surged up the new channel like a mouth opening. Too far to reach in time. Michael made the only choice that could arrive faster than his own body. He flooded the lake with ice magic, crude force rather than delicate control, and used the insulation stone embedded in Night Ray to drive the temperature towards something survivable. Bathwater, not boiling. Eve hit the lake a moment later, swept off the slope like a doll. Water swallowed her. She kept her mind intact through instinct and training, breathing magic first, then a hard pull at calm even as the current dragged her down. The water turned muddy from Nepenthes' thrashing. Direction vanished. Every attempt to float or fly became a useless kick into chaos. Terror crept in anyway, quiet, unwanted. Then a hand clamped onto her arm and held her like an anchor. Michael, holding his breath. Eyes narrowed against the sting. Eve cast breathing magic on him without hesitation. He tried to speak, already moving toward guilt, but she cut him off. I'm fine. With him braced around her, the current stopped owning her body. Eve used the space he bought her. Purification magic soothed the surrounding mud, clearing sight. Below them, Nepenthes crouched on the lakebed, slowed by the cooling water, but already regenerating tentacle roots. Eve's calculation clicked into place. This is our chance. I'll erase the tentacles. You break the core. Michael didn't argue. He only nodded, because he was her knight, and because the plan was sound. Then Eve did something that made reason stumble. She looped both arms around his neck and pulled herself close. For a stunned second, Michael's mind went white shock, heat, something primitive flaring under discipline. He seized the first explanation he could, Arachne's spatial awareness. She needed the safe zone mapped around his body. He forced his heartbeat back into order. Eve's mana core burned. Arachne spread farther than before, unprecedented, greedy, until the silver web shredded every tentacle root in their sight into pulp and purple fluid. By the time they reached the body, Nepenthes had nothing left between them and its throat. The monster opened its mouth to swallow them whole. Michael's voice cut through the water, low and urgent. "Princess, close your eyes." He surged forward and drove Night Ray into the throat, deeper and deeper, until metal hit resistance that wasn't flesh. He hooked the core out. Nepenthes screamed as it died, a wrong sound that felt designed to haunt dreams. The lake began to settle. Michael turned back to Eve. "It's finished, Your Highness." She didn't answer. The strength around his neck loosened. Her face had gone pale, slack with exhaustion, and only then did he realize the breathing magic had vanished. Dispelled. Not by mistake. By scarcity. Arachne had eaten her mana. And Eve, without thinking, had prioritized him. Understanding tightened Michael's chest like a fist. Eve's last breath slipped out as bubbles. She wasn't unconscious. She was running out now. Her hand found his forearm, weak and urgent, a wordless plea. Michael's eyes shook. "Forgive my rudeness, my princess." He sealed his mouth over hers and breathed. Air returned to Eve in a way her body recognized instantly. Survival over pride, over thought, over everything. She drank it, desperate, grateful, shameless, because shame belonged to people who weren't drowning. When her eyes finally opened, the first thing she saw was black hair drifting like waterweed, lashes dark as ink. Michael's face. Comprehension struck like a blade. She was kissing him, holding the back of his head, taking his breath. Her mind tried to shatter into panic, but her body kept choosing oxygen. When she shifted, their lips broke slightly, air leaked, and with it a thin, humiliating sound. Michael's hands slid to her cheeks, gentle as if she were something breakable, and he pulled her back in, closing the gap, sealing the world down to breath and heat and the pounding of her heart. It lasted too long to be an instant, too short to be anything else. When they surfaced, Michael carried her to shore and set her on a clean rock. Water streamed from them both. He knelt, penitent posture, guilty like a man awaiting sentence. Eve forced herself to look at him. He wouldn't meet her gaze. The tips of his ears were red. Silence curdled between them, heavy with what neither could name without losing control of it. Eve moved first, politics overriding confusion. "Let's go, Michael." She rose and offered her hand as if this were ordinary, as if command could smooth over anything if spoken cleanly. Michael stared at her hand for a long moment, at the meaning packed into it, at the mercy it implied, then took it and stood. "I understand," he said. The words should have been relief. There was bitterness in them anyway. They dried their clothes with magic. Their horses were gone, either fled by the chaos or dragged away by instinct that understood predators better than humans. They walked back. No offers to carry. No jokes. No excuses. As if they'd silently agreed that touching again would make the truth impossible to contain. Michael walked half a step ahead, trapped in his own mind, replaying the water, the mouth, the softness, the terrifying intimacy of survival. He tried to stop thinking. His thoughts returned anyway, shameful, vivid, disobedient. When he froze too long, Eve's voice reached him from behind. "Michael." He snapped back too fast. "Nothing. Don't worry." He hurried forward again, as if speed could outrun memory.